A war doesn't end well. It really doesn't end unless you have a secure, stable, post-conflict environment. Let me ask you, 1993 in Rwanda, was that post-conflict or pre-conflict? Both. And many wars in the developing world over the past 50 years have been a cycle. They're not linear, beginning and end. Rwanda had their Arusha Accords in '92, and then the genocide broke out 18 months later. And many wars, Sudan, Afghanistan, other places, they're cyclic in nature. And so the question is not, can we get to war termination, but how do we increase security so that most of the parties are willing to buy in into the political order. Now, for those of us who study just war, and we should at Georgetown, being a Catholic institution, we know that Augustine and Ambrose and Aquinas and other church fathers, the argument they were making was that political order is a moral good. We sometimes forget that in the modern society because we have it so good in the United States. But having basic levels of security, it's not just a pragmatic good, it's a moral good. It's the society within which citizens can live the good life, that notion that we take all the way back to Aristotle. And so the book argues that for a war to end well, you don't start with reconciliation, you don't start with justice, you start with trying to establish security on the ground, security on the borders, and some basic government institutions, the law and order institutions. Now, I got to tell you that many of my friends at USAID and USIP say, Eric, that's not enough. And my answer to them is, I would like a lot more, but honestly, in most of the third world, if you just got that, they'd be better off. I mean, that was what I saw traveling to Congo, traveling to Angola, traveling to Burundi, traveling to Afghanistan, traveling to Pakistan, is if you could just have a basic level of security, that would be wonderful. Well, the second, and let me give you an example of this. Think about the Korean War. Lasted for 3 years. Each year of that war, 1 million people died. Did you realize it was that many? I mean, most people don't realize 1 million people died each of the years of that war. We lost as many troops in 24 months as we lost in Vietnam. It's within 500 to 1,000 the number. It's 54,000 for Korea, it's about 55,000 for Vietnam. We don't realize the gross magnitude of the horror of the Korean War. How did it end? It ended with an armistice, but that armistice has endured, a cold peace has endured on the Korean Peninsula for 60 years now. It's actually a remarkable achievement when you think about it. South Korea has been secure. The neighborhood has remained secure. Now, I wish that there was justice against the people who attacked in the first place. And I wish that there was a more rich kind of reconciliation across the DMZ for the Korean people. We're not there yet. But I got to tell you, the track record of 1955, 1956, 1957 with no one dying compared to 1 million people, mostly civilians, dying in the early 50s, it's much better. So the second principle beyond order is justice. And the just war tradition goes back to this principle that there really is morality, there really is right and wrong in international life. Augustine said, well, the just reasons to fight are to prevent a wrong, to punish wrongdoers, or to right a past wrong. And that's really the notion of justice. And in this book, I define justice very narrowly, in a very old-fashioned way. Justice is incurring what one deserves. It's not grandiose restorative forms of justice. It begins with a very narrow punition or punishment type of justice. By the way, in the just war tradition, that should give us a little bit of modesty, because its roots in the Judeo-Christian tradition say, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And so we ought to have some modesty in pointing the finger at others. We ought to know what's wrong. We ought to limit it. We ought to prevent it. We ought to punish it. We ought to do it with some restraint and modesty. And the book gives a couple of cases of this. Let me just mention one. Consider the difference between Iraq 91 and Iraq 2003. In both cases, the Iraqi leadership was aggressive. Iraq, as you know, attacked 3 of its neighbors in its history, Iran, Israel, and then it gobbled up Kuwait. The U.S. led a coalition in 91. And then after the war, how did we punish them? With draconian sanctions, where the leadership responsible continued to build palaces and live a good life, and where the common person was smashed. How did we punish? How was the elite punished in 2003? It was a juridical process, trials for Saddam and the other elites. It was Iraqis who led those trials. It was in accord with Iraqi law and some elements of international law. And Saddam was hung by his own people. That's a much more targeted approach in the aftermath of war than the kind of war crimes that are war guilt like we had at the end of World War I or in 1991. So last, conciliation. You know, the book doesn't argue that you have to get all of these right in order in every single case, although you have to have that security element. These things are reinforcing. You know, arrows might go up and down that pyramid as you deepen justice. In theory, in some cases, it should help the order. Again, I think it's only in some cases. What is conciliation? Conciliation is being able to take your antagonist from the past and imagine a shared future with them. They don't become your brother, necessarily. It's not kumbaya. I don't sacrifice all of my claims that my family or country have against an aggressor. But it's a willingness to move forward rather than be stuck as a victim in the past. It's usually rooted in a situation where there's a really pragmatic calculus about interests and security. That's why I don't think that the Afghan Taliban is ever going to cut a deal through one of these reconciliation processes. It hasn't been in their interests to go for security in that way because they haven't felt like they needed to. And they don't have some sort of brotherly love for the coalition or apostate Afghans as they see them.